Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on what time zone you're in. Like you see my clock, it's 2:10 in the morning back home in the U.S. So is that better? It keeps dropping off my ear. My name is Joe Guadagno. I'm from the United States, a small state called Arizona on the West Coast. There's no slides to this presentation at all, so that's the only slide you're going to see. My contact information is up there. I blog a lot about stuff and tweet a lot, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out or come get me at the end of the show. So we're going to step right into it. The purpose of this talk is to kind of introduce people to debugging. We're going to start from some of the very basics and get to some semi-advanced stuff. If we have enough time, maybe some really advanced stuff to try to help you become a more efficient developer. I know when I first started, I struggled a lot with trying to figure out what was wrong with my code. In a lot of cases, we do console.writeLine or writing out to a file, or depends on how old you are, like me. So we're going to just start with some of the very basics. I'll introduce you to the menu, kind of explain what some of the things are, and then we'll start drilling into the code. Before we actually start, I just kind of want to introduce the sample program. It's not your typical hello world, but it's pretty basic. We're going to be working with this person object a lot. First name, middle initial, last name, date of birth, a list of children, and then a full name property. Really nothing that amazing. And then the program that we're going to be working through will just be looping through that. And I'll show you some ways that you can find bugs in your program and other ways to avoid them. So let's start off with the debugging menu. You'll notice that this menu is actually quite small right now. Once we start running the program, this menu grows tremendously. And I will zoom in to kind of show us what each thing does. So the first thing to notice is most people always hit F5. And I'm using the term F5 for starting. It could be different depending on your configuration. You also notice on the bottom of my screen, I have something a little it's called Resharper Presenter. It'll show the shortcuts that are on my screen, but your keyboard shortcuts could vary. So the first two options you see are Start Debugging and Start Without Debugging. Most people don't know what the difference is between the two, so I'll explain it for a quick minute. Start with debugging. So when you actually start your code, what happens is behind the scenes, MS Build writes out to a bunch of files. So you've probably seen the OBJ and the bin directory. Within there writes out something called a PDB, portable database. It's essentially a copy of your source code that's running. So when you get a breakpoint somewhere, if you're in an ASP app and you get the former yellow screen, now white screen of death, Visual Studio and the debugger kind of reads that file to figure out where things are. So how does it know to read that file? So when you do start with debugging or start without debugging, what ends up happening is Visual Studio attaches to your program. So we go and look and explore this folder. We'll see in here that there are two different files in the bin directory, depending on which version you are. So we'll talk about the difference between debug and release. But typically in the debug file, you'll see a couple of different things. So the main executable is mastering-debugging.exe. And then you'll see the, you'll see along with the associated config file. Then there's these two files right here, the PDB file and the VS host. When you actually run, Visual Studio runs this VS host exe when you're doing in debugging, because that allows it to go and read this PDB file in case there's any applications. And that's what allows you to be able to synchronize between Visual Studio and the actual lines of code. This is what's run when you do the start without debugging. So if you were to go and choose build, start debugging, the .vs host exe runs. And it's kind of important to know because when you're actually running in a production environment, you shouldn't send out those PDB files because you're shipping your source code with the application. That's why it's kind of important to do what's called the release build, which is in this menu here. You have a debug and you have a release mode. The debug writes out that PDB file. The release mode does not. It's more of an optimized file, a little bit smaller. It doesn't have all the extra plumbing inside that's needed when you're actually needing to debug your application. Let's take a look at the rest of the debug menu. Performance profile, we're not going to cover here, but it's the next step that allows you to attach to your program and see the metrics of it. You know, the I/O reads, writes, memory usage, that kind of stuff. The attach to process allows you to attach to something that you might not actually have the source code for, or it's not the current running solution. Let's say you have 2 or 3 pieces of an application. You have a web service that has a message queue that's reading, as well as a listener to process messages off the queue. You can attach to multiple different things. So if you click on the attach to process, you'll get a screen like this. The type is default. By default, that means you're just going to connect to something locally. The connection target is typically your machine name. So it's going to go through and look at your machine to see all the processes that are running on it. You'll see that it says attached to native code, meaning it's going to try to assume that it's a Windows exe, and you'll be able to get to it. There are a couple other options. If you do select, you'll see that you can attach to the GPU, you can attach to managed memory, you can attach to JavaScript, a bunch of other things. And then below is I have a list of active processes. As we can see, Chrome loves to eat up CPUs. So there's like 17,000 instances of Chrome running for each tab that you have. Another good thing with this dialog box is you notice with the connection target, it's a editable box. You can actually physically connect to another box on your network, assuming that you have the right port open. It's like something like 43972, some weird port number like that. But if you look at remote debugging, you can attach to something. So let's say that your boss's secretary has to run the end of the year TPS reports and she's having trouble executing your app. Well, instead of going in, installing Visual Studio on her machine to try and figure it out, assuming she's on the same network, you can put in her machine name and then you can actually debug the code that's running on her machine from your machine, assuming you have the source code for it. And that's kind of what attached to debugging is. So if I was to put in a different machine name here that's on the same network, I'll see a list of all the tasks that are running on that machine. Let's go take a look at the next menu in here, and that is Attached Snapshot Debugger. So the Attached Snapshot Debugger is an add-in if you use Azure. This allows you to attach to any running instance within Azure of any web job, function, or website. Assuming you enabled it on the Azure site, you can go and attach to it and read source code from your production running systems. And you see other debug targets. This varies depending on what you have installed. This laptop is relatively new, so the only thing I have in here are the Universal Windows installations, but if you have things like Android and iOS SDKs, you can actually detach there. I'm going to skip over the profiler and kind of start moving into some of the other menu items. So these are actually more when you are running into your application. So we'll skip these for a minute and start talking about breakpoints. So I'm sure most of you have done this in the past. You've either hit F9 in the gutter or pressed a little button and you got this magical red dot and this big red line. And you can see with the fonts that the dot's not proportional at all to the size of the line, which is weird. But if you hover over it, you'll see a couple of different things. Location, program.cs, comma, line 13, character 6, blah, 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 blah. It's essentially marking where the dot is, where you want the program to break. And this comes a little important later on, as we'll see, as you can start saving these off to files and sending them off to someone else. So let's take a look at some of the options for this. So if we click on the little settings icon, we get this awkwardly yellow dialog box that comes up. It takes up the whole screen, even though it's only using like 1/3 of it. But it goes all the way across. So imagine on this screen how long that yellow box is if I start it back. So let's go take a look at some of the settings. I got to scroll all the way back here. It's a good thing they don't charge by the inch in Microsoft because this will take forever. So you have two options here, or two items that you can configure. The first is condition, so let's click on the conditions and see. Now this text box is really long, but look, we still have extra white space, or yellow space in this case. So you can add conditions, and what these conditions help you do is break your application when something happens. So here we have conditional expression equals true, and here you want to type in what your expression is. So you can do lots of different things. In this particular case, we have a list of people that we're going to populate. So let's say you're running that TPS report at the end of the year that takes a couple of minutes, and you know for some reason it always fails around the 1200 record. So you can sit here and hit F5, 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 F5 1,000 times if you feel like it, or you get paid by the hour, your choice. Or you can be a little bit more productive and put a conditional breakpoint in. It says when I get to when I get to the 10,000th or 1,000th iteration of this, we'll stop. And we'll add one in a minute. You also get IntelliSense in here, so it will look at the, wow, that's really big. As you start typing, it'll try to figure it out. So it knows that there's local variable people, so I can do people equals null, and it will only break when the people part comes out null. So this is actually probably a really bad line to do that on because the people object hasn't started yet. But just to show you what happens once we do that, you can do a couple different things. So the next thing you choose is what action you want to happen. And right now, the only real action you have is to output to something. And the output, it just says, yeah, I'm at the 10,000th record or whatever you want to put in here. Again, you get the same IntelliSense. It kind of works like the string interpolation, which I always pronounce incorrectly. You could put braces around variables or objects, and it will populate those in the string. But later on in the talk, we'll find an easier way to do that. So assuming I hit close, you'll notice that there's a little plus by here now. And if I hover over it again, now you see that there are conditions on it. You can also go and disable a breakpoint. So let's say everything's running fine, or you know about this bug and you want to handle it, but at other times you want to break for it. You can temporarily disable one here, and now we're calling the red cross for our code, so things must be really bad at this point. But it shows you that you have conditions and it's temporarily disabled. And this will save with your solution. If you also notice in your directory, if we go back to Windows Explorer, you'll see that you have up in the root of your folder something, well, it's not on my machine. Oh, it's in a hidden folder that you don't see anymore. But in Visual Studio 2017 and higher, there's a new .vs folder that has all your secret settings, and this is one of the settings that it saves. So it persists your breakpoints across. We'll also see how you can go and change your breakpoints where you can hand them off to someone else. So I'm going to remove that breakpoint for now. And actually, I'll just add it back in. So we're going to add a new breakpoint here and start the actual application. So, ooh, that comes out really big. So let's do a start, and we're going to hit this breakpoint. So hopefully the people loaded. There's really nothing in here. All it does is create a list of people that are in my family. So it's going to be a pretty boring list right now. But a couple of things you'll notice. Now that breakpoint, there's a little orange or yellow arrow, which, again, is disproportionate, especially next to that gigantic magic wand. So we're going to talk about this little magic wand and what you see here, a little playlist later. It's a third-party add-in I have called Ozcode, which really enhances the debugging. But for now, we're going to see a couple different things. Once you hit play and you're at a breakpoint, a lot of new buttons light up in Visual Studio. We have this whole new Debugging Tab, which has a couple items on it. Again, remember, when I hover over or I use a keyboard shortcut, it might be different on yours. I'm using the resharper shortcuts, so things come out a little bit different. So I'm going to just zoom out because we don't need to see everything in great detail right now. Oh, except for the buttons. So we look here, you'll see on the menu, we have a lot more items that popped up. So let's kind of go through some of those. I think the stop debugging is pretty clear. Just ends the program. Detach all. What that does is tells Visual Studio, hey, keep the program running, but remove the debugger from it. I still want the app to run because I don't really care about what's happening anymore. Terminate all does the same thing. If you're running more than one project in your solution, it's going to stop them all at one time. Restart, restarts it. The attached ones we've covered. Now we're going to look at some of the steps. So there are 5 steps. So Visual Studio wants you healthy, so everything's going to be, watching your steps as you go through. So there's step backwards and step forwards. Those are more, timeline based, where you go forward or backwards. We have the step into, step over, and step out. So these are very confusing to me when I first started, so I'm going to go back and explain them. Let's say we had this app, and I'm going to stop it for a minute and restart it. So let's put our breakpoint back on unlucky line 13 and run the app. So the step into, step over, and step up, what this means is step into says go into that function. Since the populate people is a function within our application, it's going to want to go inside of that. The step over says I really don't care what happens, I just want the output of that method, so I'm going to step over it and go back. So if I hit F10 or press this button, it's going to run the code that's in that method and allow you to continue on the next line. If I were to hit step inside, so we're going to go back, and a little trick to go back if you want something to re-execute is go to the little yellow arrow, click him or her, depending on your machine, and drag it wherever you want the code. So I just dragged it back up to the line 13, which allows me to go and re-execute that code again. So it will reinitialize any variables that were up to that point. In this case, we don't have any variables, but as soon as I hit the next button or go to the next chunk of code, the people object will now be reinitialized. So I'm going to step into to show what the step into does. So I click step into, it starts running in the code. Now you see this gigantic highlighter throw up all over the place. But now I have the option to either continue to step over. There's really no other function since this just is a return, or I can do step out. What step out actually does is re-executes the rest of the lines of code in that method and brings you back. So this is the almost equivalent of a step into, but you can go as many lines as you want and then say, okay, I'm good. Let's take me back out. So let's go and just hit F9 to go to the next line. Actually, not F9. The F11 on my keyboard. And that will allow me to go to the next line, and then I'm back here with everything. You can also do a couple of other little tricks with the breakpoints. So let's zoom back out. At the end of this, you're going to be nauseous from all the zooming in and out and in and out. You'll see also here that if you have the debug window open, and we're going to cover some of the windows, it actually tells you every step that you had that happened with your app. You can also move the code around pretty easily by, again, dragging the little yellow guy around. Or you can right-click anywhere, and if you look at the menu, there is a show next statement and a run to cursor. If you choose run to cursor, it's going to execute every line up to that point. So if you're like me, what I used to do is, well, I want to stop here, so I'm going to add a breakpoint here. Or actually not there. Let's get back right here. My mouse pointer was up there, but my eyes were on the yellow line, so it should have really just know what line I was looking at. So you would normally do this, but you don't have to do this anymore. You can just go and do run to cursor, and it's going to execute every line up to that and then stop there eventually. I'm at a breakpoint, so I have to hit the enter key because I had the console read line. So now it broke there without me having to create an unnecessary breakpoint and add more red to my code. So let's see, what else do we have in the debug menu? We talked about all the step overs. Here we can go and start deleting all the breakpoints, disabling them, or we can create a new breakpoint. This dialog box, I have no idea why it exists. because no one ever uses it, but I'll show it to you anyway. So you do new function breakpoint, and you have to give it a name, and you have to magically know that string that we had up before, main.cs, line 6, character 18, whatever. No one ever can remember that, so pro tip, F9. And let's see the other one. So there's two others, I believe, on the menu we're going to cover, and then we will go out. Well, actually, let's look at the windows now. So we didn't talk about this Windows thing because when we first started the application, there's only like 3 windows you see there. Once you start an application, though, there are a lot more. So we got the breakpoint window. If we click Control-Alt-B, we'll see a window that comes up with breakpoints, and we'll go through each of these once we're done. Exception settings is another one. You can bring up the exceptions to see when you want the program to start, when you want it to stop, etc. The output, so these 3 you pretty much have open at all times when you're debugging, at least I do. It just shows you how many exceptions I generate. That's why I'm a manager now. I don't write code anymore. The GPU threads, if you're working with the graphics processor, you can see all the different threads that are running on here. I won't cover that. The same thing with task. If you're using the task library, you'll see every task that's running on the machine. So if you're doing any async await or the parallel task library and you're spinning off new threads, you can see all the threads here and watch different values on each of the individual threads. Again, we probably won't cover that here. And then you have the watch window. This is another interesting one. It's one of my favorites to use. But for some reason, we decided that 4 was the lucky number of watch windows that we needed. I don't know why. Because they're kind of, you can create as many as you want there. I've never used more than 1, but you have the option for 4. When it comes to the autos and locals, you can only stick with 1 for whatever reason. So what the watch window does is it allows you to add certain variables that you want to watch. So every time a variable changes, you'll see it. We're going to go and add a watch window and some autos in a minute. The autos window allows you to, or doesn't really allow you. Visual Studio tries to determine what you're looking at. So it's going to look at all the variables that are currently in scope. So if I'm on the other line right now, people are going to be in scope and a couple other variables, and it's going to populate them there, which we'll see in a minute. Local window kind of does that. It gives you every variable that's currently in scope, all the way up the food chain, so to speak. The immediate window lets you execute code and lets you execute most code. You can't execute everything and they're done, and we'll see. The other ones on here are very specific to certain development. So you have, if you're doing JavaScript development, these all get lit up for there, as well as XAML. Call stack we'll see a little bit. That shows you the history of your program. So if you ever see, you get your typical yellow screen of death. It says it started here on line 7. It was called by line 18 and so on and so forth. Threads, if you're using a multi-threaded application. Modules will show up if you, this is more the C++ side, if you're loading separate libraries, they'll all appear in this module section, essentially telling you what you're executing. Intellitrace, Jackrabbit just ran by. Intellitrace events, this is only in the top-end SKU for Visual Studio. I think it's now called Professional, but in 2015 it was Enterprise. Intellitrace events is very similar, I like to equate to a black box. It kind of has your application running and shows everything that's happened from beginning to end. Every call you made to a database, every memory dump you made, everything that happened in your application. They're kind of fading this away now in favor of the new Snapshot debugger, so I wouldn't get too familiar with it. So let's take a look at some of the windows. I'm going to zoom out again. On the bottom, you'll notice here I have an output window, locals, watch, immediate, and call stack. So we take a look at the locals window. You'll see right now that there are 2 locals. Because this is a sub-main or a console app, I have an arguments item here, or array, and it's telling me right now that arguments is 0, and it's of type string array. It'll also mention that I have people here, and it says I have a count of 4. The locals and watch window try to be intelligent about how you go and display items. So in this particular case, the only thing it knows is say, hey, you have a list, I'm going to display 4 items in it. There is a little caret here that you can open up and show you some really helpful tips. You know, at array 0, you have something called mastering debugging.person, and it's of type mastering debugging. But because this is an object, I can zoom in and see all the details of it. But not only can you see the details while you're in here, you can actually change them too. So here, no one calls me Joseph except for my mother when I'm in trouble. And actually, God rest her peace, her birthday was today. So here I can go and change it, and as I change it, the actual value changes. So you notice in the property right below, the full name is a helper function that I have that just adds the first name, middle initial, last name. And it went and updated, and I don't know if you can tell on the screen, but it is a lovely red telling me that that value has changed. One thing to note when you're doing this, like if I'm pulling this from a database or something, it's not going back to the database and making those changes. It's just changing the in-memory representation of it right now. But you can do that with almost anything in here, with the exceptions of if it's a read-only property. So if let's say, email address was a read-only property or only had a getter, I can't go and change the value to it. Also notice here that there is a very small magnifying glass, and if I hover over it, it says text visualize. What that is that's what's called the visualizer, or how it represents the data. Since this is a string value, it's going to represent it in string. But let's say you're looking at a JSON document or an XML document. It'll be smart enough to determine that it's an XML or a JSON document and show you that, tree view kind of thing. If you want to change the default, all you do is click on it, or if you want to change it in a different way, click on it, and then you can choose one of the many options. So these are the 4 that are out of the box, but there's lots of other visualizers, and they're very specific to what you're doing. If I'm doing XAML development, I believe there is a XAML visualizer which will display the tree in there, but I can go and choose this as HTML, and a box will pop up with a lot of white space and just show me this as HTML. Because it's just a string, it's just going to pop up as Joe. So that's the locals window. The watch window allows you to add in individual things to track. So here I want to track the first name of the person, the email address, and the last name. It's showing up as an error right now because there is no object called person that's in scope right now, because I am outside of the loop. So I'm in people, so it doesn't know this. But if I was to breakpoint right here, so let's restart the application and breakpoint here, you will see that that watch window will now have people's names in it. So it says me and person, last name, etc. One of the other things you might have noticed, which brings us into the next thing, actually let's skip that for a second and go to the immediate window. So the immediate window allows you to inspect any of the items that you have currently in memory, or go and change the value, start something else up. So here I have full IntelliSense, and I can do person dot, and I get what's up on the list. So I can do first name equals to Joe, because again, I'm not in trouble. At least not yet. We'll see when the evaluations come back, right? And I change it. So if you notice everywhere that Joe was referenced, if I go back to the watch window, Joe is now there as the first name as opposed to Joseph. And that's what the immediate window lets you. You can also see values. I don't have to set it equal to something, but I can check what it is there too. And that allows you to pretty much do anything you want with variables, set them to null, add, delete. The only thing you can't do in it is call methods or functions that you don't have access to right now. So I can't new up a class and then call a method on the class. Unless it's static, then you can go and do that. So let's take a look at something else on the screen. if you've been paying attention or watching, you might have noticed a couple little tip things up here. These are hard to see because there is no setting in Visual Studio right now to increase them, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. There's these things here called data tips. Data tips are a really cool way of anchoring something to a page that you frequently access. So here, I always want to see the name of the person I'm working with. And up here, after the populate people is called, I want to see how many people are there. So here I have access directly to it. This one here is added by Ozcode by default, So I'm going to show us how we can add a new tip. So if you go right here and right-click on a person, you're going to get a couple different things. Ooh, it's really hard to see when it's zoomed in. So there is right around, it's a really long menu. You think they could add a couple more items to this list when you right-click. There is a add data tip somewhere in here. I can't find it, so let's go the other way of doing it, which is through this menu. Oh, I can't. Oh, I know I can't do it because I'm not in that line of code right now. Let's stop this. And now if I'm over here, I should be able to add the data tip from here. No, why won't you let me add a data tip? Let's run it one more time. So one of the challenges with debugging is that there's 17,000 ways to do something. Oh, I forgot to mention this before too. You can actually add labels to breakpoints, and these are helpful if you're sharing breakpoints with other people. So here I could do person loop and then add it. And what this allows us to do is be able to share this with other people. So let's say I'm about to go on vacation and I can't figure out what that problem is on the that 1200 record for that TPS report. I can create a label, then I can come back here, and if I view the breakpoint window, which pops up here, and I'll just bring it up here so everyone can see it. So this has some extra stuff to it. It pretty much tells you everything about it. But the really good thing about it here is you can see every breakpoint in your application, and then you can create new ones, or better yet, export them or import them. So if I click export right here, which looks like the redo button, which is really strange, you will get a dialog box that just allows you to save it as XML, and you can ship off all the breakpoints you have to someone else to be able to help you with debugging. So that's that. Let's see. Here I want to, oh, here it is. So when you hover over something, you get this dialog box, and this dialog box is slightly different because I have Ozcode on there. But if you just had Visual Studio without Ozcode, it looks almost the same, but just doesn't have this fancy wand. Here's a little pin to, bless you. If you hit the pin to, what ends up happening now is behind the scenes, or behind this dialog box, I'm going to kind of get away from it. There's a little tip right here that I'm going to move around. There it goes. So this tip, you can actually save and persist to your file or share anywhere. And this will stay here and accurately reflect what's happening. So if I kind of step over and change my person, if you watch on that screen, let's zoom in so you can see it. As soon as I create a new person, it's going to show me an error because it doesn't know what person is, because I'm still iterating through people. Now once I go through, the person's there, and it shows the next person, my wife, and so on. So you can use these little data tips to help you keep variables in memory on your screen, so you don't have to keep jumping back to the watch windows or local windows and what have you. So these are always there and always available. And the lovely thing is you can move them anywhere you want. So you can cover up your whole code and not know what the actual line of code is. These are also exportable by the same menu. So if you go to Debug, you can import and export. I can't export them right now because I'm actually running the app, but I can import others and see it. So this is a very helpful way to be able to visualize what you're coming back to. Let's get another tip. This one most people never get or never know. So I'm going to take a show of hands after I'm done to see if you've ever seen this before. So here I mentioned that there's a person, and it's a mastering debugging that person. Now, what most people would typically do is, I'm going to breakpoint and go back to the class, is they would go and probably do something like public overrides toString and then print out some long string that helps you figure out who that is. Well, there's actually this hidden attribute within Visual Studio or within C# that is called the Debugger Display attribute. So I am going to uncomment out that. What the Debugger Display attribute says, whenever I'm inspecting this value or whenever I'm trying to show this value in a debugger, so the watch window, the output, that little data tips, display this string instead. So this string can be pretty much anything you want in it that's related to that class. So in this particular case, what I'm doing, and these brackets indicate the actual property name that you're using. So in this case, it's full name, and I'm going to put a comma, and then date of birth with date of birth.minute. And you see, because it's a date time for date of birth, you have access to all the properties of that. So I'm just displaying the minute of birth, which is kind of awkward, and then how many children. So now if I run the app and I go back and look at it, and now you'll see in the person, I have Joseph J. Guadagno, date of birth, time, 17, number of children. Hopefully it still says 2. Nothing happened while I was in Bulgaria. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, 1. I lost 1. How did that happen? I have to call my wife tomorrow and see, or tonight, depending on time zones. Okay, so that was that. How many people actually knew about that? 1 or 2. Wow. There's always one that knows about it. Most people don't, but it's something that's super handy. And I actually, if you want to see a lot about it, I have a blog post on my site. If you search for Debugger Display, you can see them there. Let's see, what else did we want to show? Oh, one of the things you didn't notice, let's go and stop. So keep a note of what the person looks like now, what the person full name looks like now. I'm going to stop the app and restart it. So everything that was on there before, until it executed, well, I put a breakpoint in the wrong part. So let's put a breakpoint here and then restart it. What you notice is all the tool tips or the data tips that are up there don't show you what was previously done. As you would expect, it's just showing you real time. So the person doesn't exist right now, so it's set to the C# compiler error. So these don't sit back and forth. The locations do, and what variables you want to track do, but the actual values inside don't. So let's do a little experiment. I'll show you the next thing. So if you notice, I'll show you the populate people right now, that there are 4 people in this list. So 0, 1, 2, and 3 for the zero-based, or like I like to call the European floor system or elevator system. It actually caught us yesterday because we were walking in, David and I, and the receptionist said, "Oh, go to the 2nd floor for the speaker room." So we walk up 1 flight of stairs, and we're walking around. I was like, I don't see the speaker room anywhere. So we talked to someone else and say, "Oh, go upstairs 1 more level." And then both of us had the aha moment. Oh, that's right. The floor started 0 here. We're in the U.S. All the floors start at 1. So it was challenging. But we figured it out. I just don't get the negative. How far down do you go? Like, is hell like -10 in the elevators, or is it further than that? So let's go through and look at some of this error. So in theory, if I get here, I should get an exception. I do have a try catch, so we're going to just comment out that try catch for now, just to see what happens when we get an error. I think I got one more. Yep, one more. So if I run this program now, I should not, let's take out this breakpoint. I should not get to or past here. So let's hit play, or actually I'm going to comment this out. We know that's going to stop in the behind the scenes, and there's no reason for you to watch me hit enter to get it here. So you've probably seen an exception like this before, so I can kind of go through and explain it. Now this version changed a lot in Visual Studio 2017. They got it a lot nicer than it was before, but there's lots of helpful information in here. First thing it tells you that you have an argument out of range because I tried to access the 6th element in an index or in an array when there was only 4. You get a couple other exception settings. So you can break when this exception is thrown. So let's say you're constantly working on this and you know that there's a problem every once in a while. You really don't care about it because you got really good error handling. Like I have right here that just says, write out the error. Who cares that I messed up? Or you can hit this checkbox, and what that does is turns it off. So Visual Studio now will not stop when that exception happens. I don't recommend you do that, but if you're going through and like you're testing out that the file I/O is working or handling when a file doesn't exist, and you want it to actually go into your exception handling, then turn that off. It'll save you an extra step in your debugging. You can also open the exceptions, and that pulls up a dialog box here, which shows you all the different exceptions. So by default, this is the default settings. If you open it up, you'll see a bunch of C++ stuff, which we never really care about, well, unless you're a C++ developer. But the one that most C# developers and VB developers want to see are the common language runtime errors. So if you go through here, it's going to tell you a bunch of ones that will break or not break as you go. And it's pretty much every exception known to man. So if you don't want to, or if you can't sleep, come through here and go through and look at every exception that you have. But there's something like 2,000. And you can actually add certain conditions to them. So I can click here and add a condition to say only break if this hits. And you can do that globally. So only break in system.file.io exception when it's a file not found. But otherwise, if it's a security issue or something like that, don't break. So you can go and change these, edit them as much as you want. There is a reset, so you can click this button to set it back to the original settings if you were playing around with it. Another thing for debugging, so that was it on this one. Once we uncomment this out, we'll go back to catching the exception. So let's go and uncomment this out and see one more thing we can do with debugging with exceptions. In case you're wondering, that's Control-KU for most machines. That uncomments it out. So I am going to breakpoint here to show some extra exceptions that happen. Come on, run. So if you hover over this, or when you get the exception, if I hit F10, oh, my keyboard doesn't like me anymore. If you hover over the EX, you'll get a lot more data that pops up in here that it kind of tells you what's happening at the time. I never understood this data. It always says the same thing, list, dictionary, internal, and there's rarely ever anything in there, with the occasional if you're using the SQL Server client. But what you're more looking for is the message property that tells you what's happening and the inner exception, if there are any. Because if you're doing, sometimes an exception can throw another exception, and you can store one exception inside so that you know. But this is what usually helps a lot of people, and that's the stack trace. So if I zoom in on this, it'll show me exactly where the errors happened and at what lines. So it's telling me that at system.throwHelper, throw argument out of range, at generic list, blah, 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 essentially line 20 of the code through this. But you can also see that if you open up the call stack window, and the call stack window tells you exactly what happened in your application or where it happened and when it happened. So this allows us to also go and kind of look at the history of our app. In this particular case, we only called one method, so we're seeing that we're at line 25. But if, let's say, I put another breakpoint in here, and I reran the code, and we'll see the breakpoint hit here, which I should just remove because we don't need that anymore. When you see this, now you see the call stack is different. It tells us that we're in line 30 of the populate people method that was called from the main method on line 13. And you can go and click on any one of these, and as you click on it, the color changes. So it's green, and again, this is really dependent on your theme. This green color is telling me that this is not the current line executing, but the code inside of it is running. And you can go up as far as the application starts. Since this is the real first line of the application, this is green. And you can navigate through any of them. And I still also have the same set next statement or go to previous statements if I want. The other thing we can do, which I mentioned with the watch window, which I didn't tell anyone, is when we're in something, you can add that to your watch window right away. So if I want to always watch what's this full name, I can right click and choose add to watch, and it will add it to the watch window to make sure it's always there. So you got lots of ways to view your data as you're going through. One last thing we'll talk about, again, this is Diagnostic Tools. It's only available in the premium versions of Visual Studio. This is kind of a combination of the Intellitrace features and just some of the diagnostic tools that they're bringing in. So this is kind of a timeline of your application. You can zoom in and zoom out at any point in time. Any exceptions that get fired, you'll see them here. So I fired 2 exceptions. If I click on it, it'll bring me to where that exception is in code. Since right now we're broken on that line, it's going to take me right there. But if I hit play and continue, the application will actually end, so I won't. But we would see right here a little red diamond that indicates that an exception happened here. So if you're running your app, this is like a black box that can trace along where everything is in your application. So that's all I have time for. So I'm going to bring you back to, let's stop this, bring you back to the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, if you go to my blog, there's a post on that debugger display attribute if you want to learn more about it. But thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference. See you tonight at the after party, hopefully.